expiration date. And when you keep something past its expiration date, the experience will always be less than satisfactory and will probably make you sick. I said that good. See, while Amaziah was focused on the 7,500 pounds of silver that he spent in the past, the prophet was forecasting the defeat he'd experience in the future, knowing that what he had spent in the past didn't even compare to what he was about to lose in the future. In other words, it would cost him more to keep them than it would to cut them loose. I'm stirring somebody's Kool-Aid, as Freddie Haynes would say, because while you were thinking about what you spent in the past, God sees and knows what you'll miss in the future. God sees the victory you'll miss, the opportunities you'll miss, the joy you'll miss, the peace you'll miss, the impact you'll miss. You haven't spent more on them than what you stand to lose by keeping them. And I believe I got at least 29 witnesses right here who can co-sign this affidavit, because you discovered that removing who or what needed to be removed cost you less than trying to keep them. It's cost you less headache. It's cost you less heartache. It's cost you less confusion. It's cost you less sleepless nights, less frustration, less drama, less cussing, less hollering, less screaming, less sleep, less time, less effort, less energy, less strength, and less money. You got a better credit score since you cut them loose. If you had known back then how much less it would have cost you, you would have let them go a long time ago. I know I'm right, because that's what the sailors on board the boat with the prophet Jonah had to feel about having Jonah on board. You remember, everything was fine. It was smooth sailing. We talking float on until a storm broke out. And it was only in the storm they faced, which threatened their very lives, that they discovered that Jonah was the problem, and they had a decision to make. They had thrown all of their tackle and their tools into the sea. They had already suffered setback and loss, and when their stuff failed to stymie the storm, they had to make a decision. Do we continue to keep Jonah on board and risk losing our very lives, or do we throw Jonah overboard and trust his God to work out his plan for his life? They concluded it would cost less to throw him overboard than to keep him on board, because by so doing, don't miss this, they were putting him where he belonged, in the hands of God. I'm begging somebody to understand that there are some people in your life you're going to have to put in the hands of God. Sometimes you have to let people go, and in letting them go, you're not abandoning them. You're putting them in the hands of the Lord. That means that you are trusting God to be God. Wait, let me say it plain. You are not God. Say amen, somebody, even if you don't like it. Let me say it again, make you real mad. You are not God. Your role is not to save anybody. You can't save yourself, if the truth be told. It's your role to follow God. And in following God, sometimes you got to cut some folk loose and trust them into the hands of God. Don't fixate on what you spent. It wasn't a waste. It was an education. And education ain't never been cheap. And wait, it's not what you spent in the past that should concern you. It's what you're going to miss in the future if you don't make a change. That's where God is trying to get you to focus. There are thoughts God doesn't want you to waste. Emotions God doesn't want you to exhaust. Worry God doesn't want you to expend. Dreams God doesn't want you to trash. A life that God doesn't want you to fritter away. But you will if you don't make this shift. The prophet had a word for Amaziah. Listen to what he said. It's the heart of this message. The prophet says, the Lord is able. I pause because that was a good shouting spot, but since you missed it, I'll keep going. He said, the Lord is able to give you much more than this. Amaziah, you're worried about 7,500 pounds of silver going down the drain. You are worried about your leadership, credibility, popularity, and influence. You worry about your loss, but you haven't thought about what you stand to gain. The prophet points out what he stood to gain by dismissing 100,000 mercenary troops. And this is the third teaching point of the text. Don't aim for addition when multiplication is possible, because God can be trusted to be and to provide who and what you need. Tell your neighbor, say, I know that's right. The first words of the prophet would have been enough. The Lord is able. Unlike the 100,000 soldiers with whom the Lord was not present, the prophet declared, the Lord is able. And I add, all by himself. Can I drop my kickstand right there? The God we serve is able. Before there was a when or a where or a then or a there, before was, or before ever became before, God stepped out of nowhere and stood on nothing and spoke until nowhere became somewhere. Nothing became something. The God we serve is able. Everything was created by God and continues in God's omnipotent power. There's nothing before God and nothing behind God. God is Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. The God we serve is able. The prophet said God is able to provide much more. Somebody shout much more. Hey, what Amaziah spent could not compare to much more God had. The loss that Amaziah envisioned paled in comparison to the gain that God promised. This phrase, much more, pointed not to simple addition, but to complex multiplication. The prophet was informing him that while you're worrying about what you added and what might be subtracted, God is trying to get you to see what he can multiply. You're looking at 7,500 pounds of silver. You're disturbed about 100,000 troops, but God has much more than that. God has what is needed. God has who is needed. And it is much more than what you would ever forfeit by following God. The victory that God desired for it was much more than what he could see. The resources God had ahead of him was much more than he would ever release. And I need somebody to lean in right here, because whatever you think you can amass, accumulate, and assemble is so much less than what God can provide. Are we shouting yet?